they laughed at her in her own home. Not once. Not twice. But every single day. The mother-in-law sneered that she wasn't even worthy of carrying the family name. The children echoed insults they barely understood. And the husband, the man she once trusted with her life, looked her in the eye and told her, "Even the maid has more value than you." She had given up her career, her dreams, and nearly her life to bring their children into the world. Yet, in the eyes of her husband's family, she was nothing more than a burden, a woman who ate food, cooked meals, and held no worth of her own. They praised the maid's skills in front of her, using her presence as a weapon to strip her dignity piece by piece. To them, she was beneath the help, an embarrassment who had no money, no power, and no voice. But what none of them knew was that the woman they mocked had been silently building a fortune in her own name. And the day her true net worth was read aloud, the laughter stopped. The maid looked away. The children froze. The mother-in-law begged. And the husband who humiliated her dropped to his knees. This is the story of the woman they said was below the maid, until the truth made them crawl for her forgiveness. She was still standing in the living room, her hands trembling at her sides, when the laughter of her family echoed through the house. The maid had just finished serving dinner. Golden plates and steaming dishes filled the table. Her husband's mother leaned back in her chair, her jeweled necklace glinting beneath the chandelier, and with a smirk, she raised her glass. "Now this," she said, nodding toward the maid, "is what I call a real woman. She cooks, she cleans, she works hard, not like some people in this house who only sit around eating and pretending to be important." Her words cut through the silence like a blade. The children giggled, repeating what they'd heard so many times before. "Even the maid is better than mommy." They chirped, their laughter piercing through her chest. Her husband didn't stop them. He didn't even look at her. He simply smirked, slid an arm lazily across the back of his chair, and said, "Don't take it too seriously. Mother's just telling the truth. At least the maid earns her pay." The room erupted with snickers. And there she was, the woman who once walked with pride, who had given up her dreams to build a home for them, standing like an unwanted shadow in her own house. Every word, every insult, stripped away another layer of her dignity. Her chest tightened, but she refused to cry. She refused to give them that satisfaction. Because deep inside, she carried a secret they couldn't imagine. A truth so powerful, it would flip their world upside down. They thought she was below the maid. But soon, the day would come when every single one of them would choke on those words. That night, when the house finally fell silent, she sat alone in the dark. Her eyes burned, not from tears, but from the weight of clarity. She realized then, it wasn't the insults that cut deepest. It was that she had allowed them to believe their words defined her. For years, she had shrunk herself to fit into their narrow world, silencing her brilliance, erasing her worth, convincing herself that survival meant submission. But as she stared into the quiet shadows of the house, a single thought pierced through her despair. "They have no idea who I really am." Her hands moved with steady resolve as she unlocked a drawer no one else knew existed. Inside lay documents, investments, bank books, and quiet pieces of paper that told a story very different from the one her family mocked. 8 years ago, when they laughed at her for being just a housewife, she had quietly invested the savings from her former career. She had studied at night, kept her knowledge sharp, and poured every ounce of discipline into building something for herself. Now, those quiet investments had multiplied into a fortune she had never flaunted, never spoken of, because she once believed her husband's approval was worth more than any balance sheet. But not anymore. At that desk, she made a vow. She would no longer beg for respect. She would no longer wait for their validation. From this moment on, she would rise, not to please them, but to remind herself who she truly was. And when the truth came out, the same voices that mocked her would tremble, choke, and beg. The next morning, the house bustled as usual, clattering dishes, the maid humming softly, her husband barking orders he thought made him sound important. But she was no longer the silent shadow they believed her to be. Behind her calm eyes, a plan had already taken root. She began by moving with quiet precision. While they thought she was running errands, she was meeting with her banker, preparing transfers, shifting her assets into places they could never touch. Each signature of her pen tightened the noose around their arrogance. She upgraded her appearance subtly. A new dress here. A professional suit there. The kind of clothes that didn't just cover a woman, they announced her presence. They wondered where she got them, whispered suspicions, but dismissed it as nothing. She smiled. Let them wonder. At home, she installed small cameras, in the study, the living room, even in the guest quarters where the mistress sometimes stayed overnight. Every word, every stolen touch, every whispered plan was recorded. Evidence, not just for divorce, but for total destruction. When insults came her way, lazy woman, worthless mother, even the maid is better than you, she no longer flinched. She simply nodded, her eyes cold, her lips pressed into the faintest smile. That smile unnerved them more than any outburst ever could. And quietly, she reconnected with her old world. Calls to former colleagues. Emails to mentors who once told her she was destined for greatness. An invitation to a professional gathering slipped into her hands, and this time, she said yes. For years, they had stolen her voice. Now, step by step, she was taking it back. Her husband thought he still had full control. Her mother-in-law thought she was still their doormat. The mistress thought she had already won. But none of them saw what was coming. The woman they dismissed as below the maid was quietly preparing the stage for their downfall. The day arrived sooner than anyone expected. It wasn't just a hearing. It wasn't just a family meeting. It was a stage, and every player had taken their seat. Her husband, smug in his pressed suit, leaned back with a confidence born of ignorance. His mother sat beside him, lips painted red, already rehearsing the insults she would spit the moment the discussion began. The mistress hovered in the corner, dressed elegantly, her arm draped protectively around the children as if she were already the new wife, the new mother. And then there was her, the woman they called worthless, the woman they said was beneath the maid. She didn't sit small in her chair anymore. She didn't lower her eyes. She held her head high, calm, controlled, her silence sharper than any scream. The lawyers exchanged documents. Pages rustled. Numbers were read. At first, they were small, ordinary bank accounts, property details. Her husband smirked, unimpressed, waiting for the moment he could gloat. Then came the pause. The lawyer's tone shifted. And finally, the accounts registered solely under her name. The numbers poured into the room like a flood. 6 figures. 7. Then 8. Investments across markets. Properties in prime districts. Dividends, stocks, assets that dwarfed anything her husband had ever earned. Her mother-in-law's smirk froze, her painted lips parting in shock. The mistress clutched the children tighter, her eyes darting between faces. And her husband, the man who once said even the maid was above her, went pale. His jaw clenched, his fingers twitched against the table. The silence was deafening. She leaned forward at last, her voice steady, low, and cutting. You said I was below the maid. You mocked me for years. But tell me, does the maid sit on millions? Does the maid own more than this entire family combined? No one answered. They couldn't. For the first time, they saw her not as a burden, but as the axis on which their lives turned. And in that moment, the begging began. Wait, her husband's voice cracked first, breaking the heavy silence. His hands, the same hands that once slammed the table to silence her, now twitched nervously as he tried to reach across the space between them. Darling, we didn't mean those things. You know how families argue. Words get thrown around. The mother-in-law, her pride collapsing faster than her jewels could glitter, clutched her pearls with shaking fingers. My dear, listen to me. You've always been like a daughter to me. Those harsh words, they were out of anger, nothing more. We need you. The family needs you. The children, coached by years of mockery, hesitated before joining in. One tugged at her sleeve with wide, innocent eyes. "Mommy, don't go. Grandma didn't mean it. Daddy didn't mean it. We love you." Their voices trembled, not with love, but with fear of losing the comfort her wealth now promised. And then, from the corner, the mistress herself stood. Her lips pressed into a trembling smile, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "You've misunderstood us all this time. I never wanted to replace you. I was just here to help. Please, don't break this family apart." The hypocrisy of it all almost made her laugh. These were the same mouths that called her worthless, the same hands that pushed her aside, the same hearts that found joy in her humiliation. Now, every one of them bent under the weight of her net worth. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms with unshaken calm. Her silence was deliberate, her eyes sweeping over them one by one. The power had shifted. They were groveling, and she hadn't even raised her voice. Finally, she spoke, her words as sharp as glass. "You called me less than the maid. You told me I was a burden. You celebrated my silence. And now, when you've seen my worth in numbers, you suddenly find your love again?" Her husband stammered, "No, it's not like that." She cut him off with a single raised hand. "No. It's exactly like that. And the truth is simple, I don't need you. You need me." The begging grew louder, voices colliding, desperation dripping from every plea. But her decision had already been made. In that room, in front of the very people who once mocked her existence, she reclaimed her throne, not by shouting, not by crying, but by letting the weight of her silence crush them all. The silence after her words was suffocating. They had begged, pleaded, and twisted their tongues into knots of false affection, yet she had not wavered. Her husband's composure finally cracked. The veins in his neck bulged as he slammed his fist on the table, his voice trembling with anger. "So this is who you really are? Cold, heartless, ungrateful. Everything this family gave you, and this is how you repay us?" She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing in quiet disdain. "Everything your family gave me? You mean the insults, the humiliation, the endless reminders that I was beneath even the maid? Keep those gifts. They've lost their shine." His mother lunged forward, her voice rising in a shrill cry. "You witch! You think money makes you better than us? Without this family, you're nothing. Nothing." Her calm gaze didn't flinch. She leaned forward just enough for her words to slice through the hysteria. "No. Without me, you're nothing." The mistress, sensing her fragile dream slipping away, stepped closer, her face pale. "Please, don't do this. Think of the children. Think of their future. If you walk away, what will become of them?" For a brief moment, her heart twisted at the mention of her children. But then she remembered their voices, laughing as they mocked her, chanting the cruel words they had learned from their grandmother and father. She had poured her soul into raising them, and still, they had turned into weapons used against her. She stood, her chair scraping the marble floor. Her presence alone silenced the room. With every eye fixed on her, she delivered the final blow, her voice low, steady, and cold as steel. "You wanted me gone. You wanted me forgotten. But now, I'll give you something worse. I'll leave you here. Drowning in your greed, choking on your lies, haunted by the fear that I might come back one day to take even more. You'll live every day wondering when I'll strike again." Her words hung in the air like a curse. They had called her worthless. Now, every one of them sat frozen, terrified of the power she held. And without another glance, she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps calm, deliberate, final. The door closed softly behind her, but the echo of her footsteps carried far louder than the shouts inside that house. For the first time in years, she felt air fill her lungs without the weight of judgment pressing against her chest. Outside, the sky stretched open, vast, endless, and filled with possibilities. She walked forward, not as a discarded wife, not as a servant in her own home, but as a woman reborn. The first days were quiet. She didn't rush. She didn't stumble. Instead, she carved out a new rhythm, one choice at a time. She invested in herself. Pilates in the mornings, books in the afternoons, long walks in the evenings where she relearned the sound of her own thoughts. Her wealth, once hidden, was now a shield. She no longer asked permission to spend, to dream, to build. She booked flights, attended gatherings, joined networks of women who, like her, had been silenced and underestimated. In their eyes, she saw reflections of her own scars, and in their stories, she found fuel to create something greater than revenge. It began as an idea, scribbled late one night on the corner of a notebook, a foundation. A place for women trapped in the same chains I once wore. Within weeks, the idea became action. Bank accounts funded it, lawyers structured it, and soon her vision had a name, a mission, and a heartbeat. The Rebirth Foundation wasn't just hers, it belonged to every woman who had ever been told she was less than nothing. Letters began arriving. Emails poured in. Stories of women who had endured years of abuse, humiliation, and silence, now given the strength to walk away, because her foundation gave them the courage she once had to claw out on her own. For the first time in her life, her worth wasn't measured by a man's opinion, or a family's sneer, or even by her fortune. It was measured by the lives she touched. And as she stood at the podium of her first official fundraiser, eyes shining under the soft glow of stage lights, the applause that thundered through the room wasn't for a wife or a servant or a forgotten shadow. It was for her. The woman they once said was below the maid, now standing above them all. While her name rose higher with every headline, theirs began to rot in whispers and disgrace. Her husband, once smug and untouchable, could no longer hide behind her silence. The evidence she left behind, his affairs, his misuse of company funds, the secret deals he thought buried, spread like wildfire in the same community where he once boasted of his success. Clients withdrew. Friends vanished. And the very boardroom where he used to mock her lack of worth voted unanimously to expel him. The mother-in-law, who once wore pearls and barked orders, became a ghost of her former self. Without her son's income and with creditors knocking on every door, she traded her silk gowns for second-hand dresses. Neighbors who once feared her sharp tongue now whispered behind her back as she shuffled past, her pride crumbling with every step. The mistress, the woman who smirked and wrapped herself in borrowed luxury, discovered that her beauty could not buy permanence. When his money vanished, so did her devotion. She tried to cling to another wealthy man, but the scandal of her name followed like a shadow. No one trusted her. No one wanted her. The same society that once applauded her elegance now dismissed her as damaged goods. And the children. The ones who had parroted their grandmother's cruelty, who once giggled as they called their mother worthless, began to see the cracks in the walls of their perfect world. Schoolmates whispered. Teachers frowned. They watched their father unravel, their grandmother fall, their new mommy vanish, while the mother they mocked appeared in magazines, on stages, in headlines, her name spoken with respect. In the silence of their small, shrinking home, they began to realize who had truly been beneath the maid all along. The empire that mocked her had collapsed into dust. And she had never needed to lift a hand. Freedom didn't come with fireworks. It came with silence, the kind of silence that wrapped her like a blanket after years of chaos. She no longer lived in a house that echoed with insults. She no longer woke to the sharp tongue of a mother-in-law or the cold sneer of a husband. Her mornings were her own. She brewed her coffee, opened her laptop, and planned her future with the steady hands of a woman who finally knew her worth. The foundation flourished. Women from every corner of the country reached out, some whispering through tears, others walking boldly into her office. Each one carried scars that mirrored her own, and each one left stronger than they arrived. That was her true wealth, not the numbers in her bank account, but the lives she rebuilt with it. One evening, after a long day of work, she stood at her window overlooking the city lights. The world stretched wide before her, endless, inviting. For the first time in years, she wasn't trapped by someone else's expectations. She belonged only to herself. Her phone buzzed with a message from an old ally, someone who had once believed in her when she had forgotten herself. "Dinner tomorrow?" "No pressure." She smiled softly. Perhaps she was ready to open her heart again, but this time, not out of need, not out of desperation, but out of choice. As she turned off the lights and prepared to rest, her mind replayed the words that once defined her: "You're below the maid." Now, those words no longer cut. They no longer burned. They were nothing more than ashes scattered in the wind. Because she had risen. Higher than the maid. Higher than the family that mocked her. Higher than the world that tried to bury her. And she would never bow again.